time, about 241,000 Afghans and Pakistanis were killed, including more than 71,000 civilians. That's according to Brown University's Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs. In 2011, 10 years ago, there were roughly 100,000 troops, U.S. troops, in Afghanistan. There are now just 650 assisting with security in Kabul. The first 6 months of 2021 saw a 47% increase in civilian casualties compared to 2020, with 1,659 people killed. That's according to the United Nations.
And 20 years after the war began, following the attacks of September 11th, there are concerns that the entire country could fall here in the coming weeks. Joining us now is Sebastian Junger. He is a journalist and the co-director of the Oscar-nominated film Restrepo that depicts a U.S. platoon in Afghanistan in a particularly dangerous part of the country. Sebastian, thank you so much for being with us. You know, you have been such a voice in describing really the narrative of the war in Afghanistan. And I wonder now what you're thinking as you see this happening.
Well, I'm heartbroken. It's a country that I started going to in the mid-90s and sort of fell in love with it. And the efforts of Ahmad Shah Massoud and the Northern Alliance to keep Afghanistan from being completely overrun by the Taliban were, in my view, really sort of heroic. Not that those people didn't have their flaws. So, but now, and this is predictable to me. I mean, I was there in 2001. The Taliban collapsed very quickly, and we didn't sort of finish the job. Like, we left 15,000 troops there, and this is a huge, complicated country. There's 40,000 cops in New York City, by way of comparison. We left 15,000. And basically to Iraq. And the Afghans would say to me, you know, we know what happened to the Kurds in Iraq. You allied with them and during the first Gulf War, and you completely abandoned them, and they were slaughtered. So we're going to be very careful to say that to me about this country. And in the long run, it took 20 years, but they were right. I mean, yeah.
What do you think? What is the significance to you of the fact, you know, you mentioned the Taliban collapsing very quickly. That was due in, of course, because of, you know, U.S. special forces linking up with the Northern Alliance. And what we've actually seen now, that the Northern Alliance was resisting the Taliban has swept through the North. You know, what does that say about the strength of the Taliban here?
Well, obviously, they are presenting themselves as an overwhelming force, and I don't think they're fighting their way through the country. That would, frankly, take a lot longer. And this is the way this works. There are negotiations. So the Taliban forces will draw close to a town like Jalalabad, where I was in 1996, and I watched the Taliban delegation come to Jalalabad. They were staying at the same hotel I was, this Bangar hotel. They looked at me very skeptically and negotiated with the leaders of Jalalabad and negotiated the surrender. They didn't take Jalalabad; it was handed over to them. I think that's probably what's happening with commander after commander all around the country. They're not fighting for it, and they're not fighting because the government forces are not fighting because the system's completely corrupt, and among other things, they can't get resupply, they can't get ammunition because that stuff is being sold by bureaucrats in Kabul.
I want you, Sebastian, to listen to something that the president said last month.
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well-equipped, as well-equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable. The jury is still out, but the likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely.
What do you think of hearing that, of Biden saying the Taliban overrunning the entire country is unlikely? You know, what is your, now looking back on that sound, what do you think? And also, what do you think the story will be here? Is it going to be a story of like a Vietnam 2.0?
Well, obviously, it was wishful thinking or a politic statement that wasn't sincere. I can't know the president's mind. But for me, I mean, first of all, we can get people out of the U.S. Embassy. Clearly, we've got the assets and the capabilities to do that. For me, the unknown is what's going to happen to the Afghan people. And when he says, no, they probably won't overrun the country, that probably contains a terrible truth, which is if it happens, there will be a huge bloodletting, as there was in the 90s when they took over. Human rights for women, women's education, basic issues of human dignity, particularly for women and minority groups in Afghanistan, those things will be completely trampled. It's catastrophic in human terms. And I wish the president, who I admire in other ways, I wish the president had acknowledged how high the stakes are, particularly for the Afghans. I think for the U.S., it's probably the stakes aren't.
Sebastian Younger, thank you so much for being with us and giving us your perspective on what is really changing by the hour in Afghanistan. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
A record number of children are now hospitalized in the U.S. with COVID. Why some parents are struggling just to get their kids a test. Two prominent GOP senators, both from the great state of Kentucky, but Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul really couldn't be more different when it comes to dealing with coronavirus that is, again, ravaging their state and the nation. Melanie Zanona joining us now with some new reporting on this. Mel?
Hey, good morning. So, Brianna, these two Kentucky Republicans couldn't be more diametrically opposed when it comes to the coronavirus. Mitch McConnell has arguably been one of the most consistent and responsible voices in the GOP when it comes to the pandemic. He's been urging people to get the vaccines. He paid for radio ads to get that message out. Early on, he was talking about the importance of wearing masks and social distancing. And Rand Paul, meanwhile, got suspended from YouTube this week for spreading misinformation about masks. He's publicly sparred with Dr. Anthony Fauci, and he himself refused to wear a mask last year, even after he contracted COVID-19. Now, of course, this is not the first time these two have been at odds. Rand Paul, of course, is the thorn in the side of a lot of colleagues in the Senate, Republican and Democrats alike. But this is different than politics and policy. This is public health. And Rand Paul, even though he says he's not anti-vaccine, his other messaging and behavior is threatening to directly undermine Mitch McConnell's mission to get people in Kentucky and beyond vaccinated and to protect them. And this is a mission that's deeply personal for Mitch McConnell, a polio survivor. And not to mention, their home state of Kentucky is seeing cases and hospitalizations on the rise.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear McConnell seems much more responsible. He seems responsible, and Rand Paul seems irresponsible, quite frankly, when it comes to the way they're dealing with the coronavirus messaging. What does McConnell think about Rand Paul behind the scenes? Because, you know, he keeps it very much under wraps in public.
He does, and they have a somewhat of a roller coaster of a relationship. You know, they don't always see eye to eye. But look, in this case, I've talked to people familiar with Mitch McConnell's thinking, and they say that he believes the best way to deal with people like Rand Paul and others in the party who are either spreading misinformation or just have, you know, really struck an anti-vaccine tone is to just counteract with pro-vaccine messaging. He doesn't want to take these members head on. He doesn't want to confront them and call them out and pick head on fights. And so he is just dedicated to continually pushing that message. And as I mentioned before, he even paid for campaign with campaign cash for radio ads in his home state of Kentucky to get that message out.
I says Rand Paul did not. Do we know? I'm assuming.
Yeah, we are unclear where Rand Paul is.
All right. All right. Melanie Zanona, thank you so much for that report.
Thank you.
So with coronavirus cases, the numbers growing, including among children, there is a new concern: testing. So one pediatrician documented the struggle to get his young daughter tested and issued a stark warning, calling testing capacity for the youngest among us inadequate. Dr. Scott Hadlin is chief of adolescent medicine at Mass General Hospital for children and a father of two. Thanks for joining us. So Dr. Hadlin, you know, you're a doctor in Boston and you couldn't get your own daughter tested easily. What does that tell you?
Thanks so much for having me on this morning. Yes, I was shocked to learn how difficult it was to get testing for us. My daughter got sent home from daycare. She had a fever. And then we called our pediatrician. They had no appointments. We tried one testing center, waited for an hour in a parking lot, learned that it would take 3 days for testing results to come back. Finally found another testing center on the other side of town that had limited hours later on in the afternoon, got testing. Fortunately, she was COVID negative, but all of this told me that testing is just woefully inadequate right now. It shouldn't have taken me half of a day to find testing for my daughter, because when we don't have testing, kids are out of school and adults are out of work.
And that's going to come head on into the school year. You know, I've experienced something similarly, just anecdotally, talking to a lot of people in Washington, D.C., where I live, that testing is easy and quick for adults. But when it comes to kids, it is more difficult if they're under 3 years. What is the need when you're up against a school year?
Well, that's really critical. You know, we are a year and a half into this pandemic now. We know the basics. We know what works. We know that kids and people more generally need to be physically distanced from one another. We know that they should be wearing masks. But we have also known from the earliest days of this pandemic that we need lots of testing. And we need that testing to be accessible, ideally free of charge. And we need for it to have rapid turnaround so that we can get results quickly. And now is no more important a time than ever. We're heading back into the school year. Delta variant infections are on the rise. Kids are disproportionately affected by these infections. And so I'm worried that we're not ready for what's to come.
You know, let me just state the obvious, too. We're talking about a population that is not vaccinated and won't be anytime soon, not soon enough, at least, to make any kind of difference to this. So testing would be vital. What's standing in the way?
Well, you know, I think there's a lot of different barriers here. So as I experienced, a number of testing centers have really cut back on their hours. And so the testing center that we went to, and by the way, I'll say the city of Boston, where we live, has wonderful testing. You know, we have some of the best healthcare in the world. And we were able to get good testing, but the hours that we could go were really quite limited. There were only sort of 3-hour windows that you could go to our particular testing center. You know, they don't have testing hours every day. Sometimes it's only every other day. Often it's not on weekends. Almost certainly it's not in the evenings or during times when parents can actually take their kids in. So I think just access is one huge issue. You know, there have been a lot of developments too in home rapid antigen testing, which is a fantastic option for many families. But unfortunately, many of those aren't yet recommended for young children, and they have a large out-of-pocket cost. Each of these tests often costs, you know, $25 typically. And if you need to test multiple family members, those costs really add up. And so we really need for testing to not only be accessible, but ideally free of charge.
Dr. Scott Hadlin from the Hub of the Universe, we appreciate you being with us this morning. New intelligence on Russia election interference reveals the scope of efforts. The efforts are much larger than previously thought, and I'm talking about the current efforts. The Biden administration has received reports indicating that Russian attempts to interfere in U.S. elections are evolving, and in fact, they never stopped. Natasha Bertrand has this story. She joins us now, and it's important to note this comes even after Joe Biden issued his warning to Vladimir Putin.
And after more than 24 Russian entities were sanctioned in the spring over their election interference in 2020. So clearly the Russians have not really gotten the message here. And President Biden made deliberate mention of the Russian efforts to sow chaos and sow disinformation ahead of the 2022 midterms a few weeks ago in his remarks to the intelligence community, kind of sending a signal to the Russians that, hey, we know what's going on here. Our intelligence community is closely tracking all of these efforts to again interfere in our democratic process. Now, what we're told is that these intelligence reports that have gone to the Biden administration basically say that the Russian strategy is largely the same, right? They want to sow chaos, they want to sow misinformation, they want to create divisions in American society. But what we're also told is that their tactics are evolving because they can't do the same thing they did in 2020 or 2016. They need to kind of up their game. And in doing so, as the Russian intelligence agencies kind of compete with one another to try to one-up each other into how they can interfere best in American politics, they come up with new tactics and new kind of creative ways to interfere. So that's what the intelligence community is seeing right now. The Russian efforts never actually stopped, but they are evolving and they are growing more aggressive and changing as time goes on.
What evidence, if any, is there that other countries are also trying to interfere, countries like China and Iran?
Yeah, so these countries have not been shown to be targeting the 2022 elections specifically. That's what we're told the intelligence is showing right now. The Russians are very focused on exploiting these political divisions in American society with the aim of bolstering one candidate or another, especially in down ballot races in 2022. And so they're kind of laying the groundwork for that, especially around vaccines and masking. That's obviously a very politically divisive issue. But the Chinese and the Iranians are more focused on kind of bigger picture kind of exploitation of politicians, for example, of bigger picture issues that won't be as insidious as what the Russians are doing. That is what we are told. And so the tactics are very different here. Kind of what the Russians are doing is more subtle and more covert, whereas what the Chinese do, for example, is more overt. They try to influence public policy and discussions surrounding a certain issue.
Bad, but different, as it were. Natasha Bertrand, thank you very much for your reporting. Appreciate it. New Day continues right now.
Welcome to our viewers here in the United States and around the world. It is Friday, the 13th, Friday, August 13th.
What could possibly go wrong?
I know. Let's hope not much, right? 9 million immunocompromised Americans are now authorized by the FDA to get a third coronavirus vaccine shot. So this will be good news to many folks who have been worried about this. And this is coming after a recent study by Johns Hopkins researchers. What they found was that vaccinated immunocompromised people are 485 times. Can you believe that? That's such a big number. They're more likely that many times to end up in the hospital or to die from COVID-19 compared to the general population that has gotten the shot. And the CDC's vaccine panel is scheduled to meet today to discuss booster doses. So the amount here. Dr. Fauci says it is inevitable that even healthy people will require booster shots soon.
Right now, the decision is we don't need to do it right now. It's not imminent. But we're preparing as if it will be imminent. So we're going to be ready to do it whenever the data shows that the protection has gone below a certain level because of a combination of the durability of protection and the special effect you're seeing with the Delta variant.
Dr. Fauci also says the Delta variant is putting more children in hospitals. At this moment, nearly 1,800 children are battling COVID in the hospital. That's the highest number at any point during this pandemic. So joining us now is CNN Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Sanjay, this decision from the FDA came overnight, the decision to authorize a third shot for the immunocompromised. How significant is this?
I think it's really significant for that group of people, 9 to 10 million people that we're talking about. Not surprising for all the reasons you just mentioned. I mean, I think there's been increasing evidence of two important things. One is that they've been measuring antibody levels. They see the antibody levels have waned, but also that these people were getting more likely to end up in the hospital, more likely to get severely ill. So it's really a combination of those two things. Measuring antibody levels alone may not be the thing that everyone's focusing on, but the fact that people were getting sick. Show you who we're talking about here. Immunocompromised. This is going to be something that we are going to want to have them define clearly. Solid organ transplant recipients, they take medications to suppress their immune system so that their own immune system does not attack their new transplanted organ, right? So they are clearly on that list, but there are other people on the list as well, people who have recently have had chemotherapy, people who take immunosuppressants because of autoimmune disease. Again, they're going to need to define that clearly, but it's going to make a big difference in millions of people's lives, I think. In fact, I want to introduce you to a patient who's been sort of struggling with this and is probably now going to live a different life after this is officially passed by the CDC. Take a look.
39-year-old Kimberly Cooley got her second dose of the COVID-19 vaccine back in February. She hoped at the time it would be a game changer.
I knew that there was a possibility that it would not work for me, but given the situation with COVID and the pandemic, it was definitely worth the try.
She lived her life, hugged her nephews, felt free once again. But then
I went to a local clinic near my home and requested a antibodies test and received the results, and I did not mount any antibodies.
It wasn't a surprise for Kimberly because back in 2018, she had had a liver transplant and now takes medications to suppress her immune system so her new liver isn't rejected. Unfortunately, that also means she is immunocompromised. Her immune system has a much harder time making antibodies after receiving the COVID vaccine.
We really don't have an immune system to fight off the virus. And so, it's it's kind of a open game.
A study of over 18,000 fully vaccinated transplant patients like Kimberly found that relative to the general population, they were 82 times more likely to develop a post-vaccination infection and 485 times more likely to be hospitalized or die from COVID-19.
I have to really be cautious about going into crowds and who I'm around. Every single move I make regarding my life is calculated.
In addition to her already high risk, she lives in Mississippi, one of the least vaccinated states in the country and one with high transmission of virus as well. A risky mix, one that leaves her with little community protection to feel comfortable enough to connect with her young nephews.
It's just too risky. I mean, with my being a transplant patient, they almost lost me once, and I don't want to put myself in a position for them to almost lose me again.
We're already seeing clinical trial data on solid organ transplant patients where a third dose of one of the 2-dose regimens may boost their immunity.
This is what Dr. Amish Adalja is talking about. Look at this graph. In transplant recipients who received the standard 2 doses, they developed some antibodies. But after a third shot, look what happened. The antibody levels went way up. And this is why the FDA is now authorizing a third shot for the roughly 9 million immunocompromised patients in the country.
At this time, only certain immune-compromised individuals may need an additional dose.
But none of this necessarily means that another shot will be recommended for everyone else.
What are you looking for as maybe some early clues that we would need booster shots?
I want to know what's happening to these patients clinically. Are they getting breakthrough infections? And are those breakthrough infections clinically significant, meaning are they severe enough to land them in the hospital?
For now, the vaccines continue to protect most of us very well against severe illness. As for Kimberly, though, her own doctors have already signed off on her getting that third shot. And when she can,
that will be the first thing that I do is go see my nephews and sneak that one more hug in.
I mean, that is what matters right there. Sanjay, I wonder what happens next for people like Kim.
Well, the CDC is now going to officially recommend this. The FDA authorizes this third shot. The CDC recommends it. And as part of it, they're going to define again who is considered immunocompromised. I think it's pretty clear Kimberly is considered this because she's had this organ transplant. But, that's going to be important. And they're also going to need to define specifics like right now we think 28 days at least after your second shot, could you be eligible for this third shot? So, specifics like that are what's going to happen. But you already heard Kimberly's already gotten the okay from her doctor. So she's going to be in line pretty quickly to do this. I do want to point out again, what is so interesting is that immunity is made up of so many different things. We've talked about this on your program so many times. Antibodies, yes, we measure those. They're easy to measure. But there may be other things that the vaccines do in terms of providing immunity. And unless people are getting severe illness after vaccination, it's not clear when or even if those third shots will be recommended for everyone else. So we'll see. We'll see. But for right now, it's just the immunocompromised.
All right, Sanjay, and if you can just stand by for us because we have a bunch more questions for you coming from our viewers. We're going to be asking those of you here just a little bit later. In the meantime, A Tennessee ER doctor is making an impassioned plea on Facebook as his hospital is running out of beds. He writes, "This past week has been one of the most exhausting and disheartening of my career. 6 weeks ago, there were 200 COVID patients in hospitals in Tennessee. Today, there are 2,000, a 1,000% increase in 6 weeks. There's been a lot of talk about personal freedoms and mandates and government overreach and such. And someday, when the sun is shining again, we can sit down and have some interesting conversations about all that. I might even agree with you on some of those points, but I can't do that today, not today, because there are no beds." Tom Foreman is joining us now with the latest numbers, and they are alarming, Tom.
They are, Brianna. All across this country in intensive care units, this drama is playing out. This is the load on ICU bed utilization by state in general. Of course, red is bad, an awful lot of load out there. But specifically, look at the COVID beds, where it's above 25%. And you can see that some of these places are absolutely being hammered by this additional load, particularly if you look at the South down here. where 25% and above, well, we know that some of these are way over 25% in terms of their COVID load. But look at that area down there, and if you want to know how much above it is, just look at the raw numbers. Florida, 587 beds left. Alabama, 90. Louisiana, 195. Mississippi, 0. Arkansas, 8. Oklahoma, Texas. And bear in mind, if you can find a bed open, if you get sick in Miami because you didn't get vaccinated, because that's who's getting sick mainly, and you need to go to the hospital, if you get sick in Miami and you have to go to, say, Jacksonville or Tallahassee, that's a haul to make, a very difficult haul to make. Same thing, Mobile to Birmingham. If you're down in Galveston and you have to go to Amarillo, the distance also matters. It's not just the beds are there. They're not everywhere. They're where they are. You would have to find them. You would have to get to one. And I want you to look very specifically at these numbers. Florida, the number there. Mississippi, the number there. Texas, the number there. Collectively, what are we talking about? Some 900 beds in 3 different states there. And yet, listen, 900 beds in 3 different states where you're talking about somewhere north of 50 million people. 900 beds, 50 million people. And yet, this is what their governors have been saying. You can either have a free society or we can have a biomedical security state. And I can tell you, Florida, we're a free state. Ron DeSantis down in Florida. Greg Abbott over in Texas. The path forward relies on personal responsibility, not government mandates. Governor Tate Reeves in Mississippi, where they have no beds. There will be no lockdowns and there will be no statewide mandates. This has been their position. Yes, they say you should get vaccinated, but they want to take no steps to make people wear masks, no steps to say people should have to be vaccinated or show that they are vaccinated, all in the name of freedom. And I'm telling you, Brianna, if you're riding around one of those states trying to find a bed right now for someone who is gasping in the seat next to you, I don't think you feel very free.
No. And look, it's like that Tennessee doctor said. He would love to discuss all of these things.
Sure.
But not now, not today, not when he doesn't have any ICU beds, because that is the reality.
You can't argue with the firemen when your kitchen's on fire.
That's right. That's right. Tom, thank you so much for that.
So major news developing at a breakneck pace in Afghanistan. The Taliban has taken control of the second largest city in that country, Kandahar. 14 provincial capitals have now fallen really quickly. We're talking in the last several days as the Taliban sweeps across the country. The U.S. now rushing 3,000 troops to Afghanistan to help evacuate embassy staff. President Biden says he is not second-guessing the decision to withdraw all U.S. forces by the end of the month. CNN's Kylie Atwood is live at the State Department this morning, where Kylie, all of a sudden, serious concern about U.S. Embassy personnel and the need to get all Americans out fast.
Yeah, that's right. And as we're watching this unfold, these incremental developments really make you think about the fact that what is happening right now threatens to permanently stain President Biden's foreign policy legacy. Now, we should note, John, that he has always said that he would pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. But the way in which this is going down is alarming, as you see these Taliban gains across the country, as peace talks with the Taliban are going nowhere, as the human rights situation is, frankly, very alarming, given that there are women and children being left in areas that are taken by the Taliban. And now there are these potential threats to U.S. personnel on the ground. Now, of course, the State Department, the administration is doing all that they can to assure that any of these U.S. personnel get out of the country safely. They are preparing to take some of them out now, potentially take some of them out later. They are saying that some of that diplomatic corps is remaining on the ground. But President Biden has repeatedly said that U.S. troops are leaving the country, but America is not leaving the country. That promise is now in jeopardy as we are watching what is unfolding. Now, as administration officials are watching this, they acknowledge that it is not going down exactly how they thought it would. But they don't think that there are grand political implications for the president here, because the American people largely are supportive of getting U.S. troops home from Afghanistan. They've been there for 20 years. The other thing that administration officials are focused on is China. Now, of course, that really, to most folks, has nothing to do with Afghanistan. But as you look at the foreign policy challenges, the Biden administration views competition with China as the primary foreign policy challenge,
as their focus now. They want to shift resources towards that, and that may come at the expense of shifting resources away from Afghanistan. I want to point out that Secretary of State Tony Blinken gave a speech this week. He spoke about the need to invest in infrastructure and innovation here in the U.S. to compete with China. In that same speech, he didn't mention Afghanistan once, even as we are watching what is unfolding there. So they are essentially saying, look towards China, look away from Afghanistan, but we can't do that right now because of what is unfolding on the ground, because of the human rights implications, because of this very, very quickly deteriorating situation. John?
The fact that they have to send thousands of troops in to help get people out, that indicates it is not going down the way they planned. Kylie Atwood, thank you so much for your reporting. Please keep us posted.
As part of its drawdown of troops in Afghanistan, the U.S. government also recently began evacuating more interpreters who had aided the military in their operations. But there are still thousands of Afghan interpreters and other support staff and their families who have been left behind, and they're now facing persecution and maybe even death from the Taliban. I'm joined now by someone who's dealing with this right now, Saeed Noor. He is an Afghan interpreter who emigrated from Afghanistan, joined the army, and has served in the army as well, and is now trying to get his family out of Afghanistan. Saeed, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're sick and sleepless with worry. You have not been able to get your family out. What is the status of them?
As you know, the security situation is getting worse on the ground, and the Taliban are making a lot of progress there. So especially with my family, as they see that progress, they just get worried and worried, like every time, and they keep calling me every hour of the day and night, and they just want to know about their fate, how they're going to get out of Afghanistan, or they're going to become the next target for the Taliban. So far, I have not heard any positive feedback from the U.S. government as far as pulling my families out of Afghanistan and bring them into the safe haven to the United States.
Okay, so they're in a holding pattern. They're in Kabul. We had you on a couple of weeks ago, and you talked about the treacherous journey that they took through Taliban checkpoints, where they had to, use their wits in order to move into Kabul. You are a U.S. citizen. You are a U.S. veteran. What does that say if you are having problems getting your family out? What does that say about all the other Afghan interpreters and support staff and their families?
Very difficult situation for them as well, too. As I have mentioned before, when my parents and my siblings were coming from Coast Province, southeast, making their way all the way to Kabul, they had to use a lot of different excuses. My mother had to buy a lot of medications. She had to have a lot of prescriptions. And she was stopped by the Taliban at the checkpoints coming to Kabul. And she had to explain to them that she's seeking a medical treatment in Kabul, and that's how my family were allowed to go. But even for myself, I served this country as a civilian, as an interpreter for 17 years. And I came back and I joined the U.S. military, served this country as a U.S. military soldier, and deployed back to Afghanistan. It is a difficult situation for myself. Again, if I put myself in the shoes of the other interpreters who do not have any U.S. contact, or who are the local interpreters in Afghanistan, their life is as much danger as my family life is, and they have no way to get out of the country.
Saeed, are you surprised by how quickly these provincial capitals have fallen and that Kabul is now under threat so soon?
I'm very, very surprised. That's something that never came to my mind. It never crossed my mind. By having 300,000 Afghan forces in Afghanistan, so that Taliban making the gains and Taliban taking over the district centers, started from taking over the district centers and taking over the provincial capitals. And so far, they have captured 14 different provincial capitals where we had the Afghan government had the strongest forces there, and the Taliban were able to take over. And it is half of the country, and I'm very concerned about the situation there. And I'm sure the Taliban, pretty soon, they're going to make their way into Kabul, and it's going to be a chaos, and this country will turn into a civil war.
Yeah, it is a bad outlook at this point in time. Saeed, we are thinking of you. We are thinking of your family. We're going to keep checking in with you to see if they can get out, as it seems they are supposed to be able to do under what this administration has promised. Saeed Noor, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.